Hi guys, back to Wurzel Gummidge, chapter 15. Who's coming to the party? When they reached the field, they peeped over the hedge rather nervously. Why, whatever are those? Whispered Susan. For a moment she thought that the field was full of giant rooks, but when she looked again, she saw that the large flapping things that were stalking over the furrows were scarecrows. There were more than a dozen of them, and they were all walking very queerly indeed. There's a very wide one over there, said John. And then he saw that the two scarecrows, who had only one leg each, had linked their arms and were taking it in turns to hop forward. Another one, who was evidently not used to walking, picked up one leg in both hands, planted it firmly in front of him, then seized the other leg, and so on. It would be dreadful for him if he were in a hurry, said Susan. She shrank back into the shadow of the hedge as she spoke, for a very short, three-legged scarecrow was walking past. No, she was not exactly walking, for she appeared to be entirely jointless and moved with a curious rolling gait. The children guessed that her legs had once belonged to a milking stool. Her velveteen coat reached the ground, and her sailor hat was much too large for her. It rolled sideways as she trundled along, now falling over one eye, now over the other. However, she seemed to be a cheerful, determined little creature. Every time she fell over, she murmured, "Ups-a-daisy, ups-a-daisy." "Do you think we might speak to her and ask where Gummidge is?" whispered Susan to John. "She seems quite kind, and I don't like the look of some of the others." The small scarecrow rolled over into the hedge as she spoke, and lay there, rolling feebly and muttering, "Ups-a-daisy, ups-a-daisy." "Can I help you?" asked Susan, and she held out her hand. The creature grinned at her and held out an arm as round as a rolling pin. Its hand was covered with a scratchy woolen glove, and as Susan took it, she could feel paper rustling inside. "Thank ye, my dear," said the scarecrow. "And what field do you come from?" "We don't come from any field," replied Susan rather indignantly. She didn't like being mistaken for a scarecrow, even though she did love Gummidge. "One of them new-fangled kind from the allotment gardens, are you?" she asked pleasantly. "Someone must have taken quite a deal of trouble when they cut your face out." "It isn't carved," said Susan. "Stuffed, is it?" she answered. "Stuffing's all right in the dry weather, of course, but it does hold water terribly in a wet season." Susan felt that it was useless to argue with her, so she changed the subject by saying, "Do you know where Wurzel Gummidge is?" "I keeps on seeing him, and then I keeps on losing him again as I turns round," said the fat scarecrow. "Last time I looked, he was talking to a lady." "What sort of lady?" asked John. The little scarecrow dropped her voice. "A daft one," she answered. "She was dressed by a loony who used to be a hairdresser. I know her well because I live in the field next to his garden. They say he had a lot like her in his shop in London. She's got a pink wax face and yellow hair, and she wears a blue paper bonnet. But she's a good scarer. Not a bird will come near her." "I should like to see her," said Susan. "There's no mistaking her," replied the little creature. "You can come along with me if you like." She continued to roll oddly along by the side of the hedge. John and Susan walked on beside her. "I can see you are jointed," she panted presently. "Can you sit down quite easily?" "Of course we can," said John. "I've always longed to be able to sit," she said. "Still, I mustn't grumble. I've 3 legs to be thankful for. They say there's going to be a battle tonight," she continued. "Who against?" asked Susan. "We'll have to pick sides before we can tell that," she replied. "I hope Mr. Gummidge will pick me. I like Mr. Gummidge." "She doesn't," said a mournful voice just behind them. The children jumped round and saw Wurzel Gummidge himself. Sitting beside him was a large, pink, waxen lady. She was wearing a pink paper dress, and she was simpering at the reflection of her own face in a mirror that she held. The children had often seen people exactly like her in the windows of the hairdressers' shops. Gummidge was gazing at her in the saddest manner, but the Pink Lady went on admiring herself and took the slightest notice, not the slightest notice of him. "Don't you think she's beautiful?" asked Gummidge. And then, before anyone could reply, he added, "She doesn't care for my face." "What a shame!" cried Susan. "I've tried everything," continued Gummidge. "I've tried coaxing and petting and scolding and all sorts. I've even tried kissing." The Pink Wax Lady shuddered as he said this. "Kissing's so difficult," complained Gummidge. "I don't seem able to get the time right. Either I kisses before I reach her, or else my mouth slips on her face." Susan noticed then that there were a few muddy streaks on the waxen lady's bright pink cheeks. Suddenly, the short, fat Scarecrow spoke. "If you'll excuse me, Mr. Gummidge," she said, "I don't think that lady is the wife for you. Her face would run in the hot weather." "Where to?" asked Gummidge anxiously. "It would melt." "I wouldn't mind that," said Gummidge with an affectionate smile. "I'd always know her by her hair." Susan giggled, and John stuffed his handkerchief into his mouth, though Emily Goodenough had often told him that it was a horrid thing to do. "Won't you marry me?" asked Gummidge as he turned to the Wax Lady. "Oh, Mr. Gummidge," she simpered, "this is so very sudden." "It's a sudden world," retorted Gummidge, and he flung a stiff arm across her shoulder. The lady moved indignantly away. "Don't," she said pettishly. "I shall if I chooses," said Gummidge suddenly. "I'll do what I like with my own arm. You might be marrying me instead of me marrying you, the way you're going on." "I'm not going to marry you," said the Wax Lady in a shrill, high voice. "I'm going to marry a gentleman out of one of the shop windows." "Then I hope he'll melt," shouted Gummidge. "And if he does, you needn't come worrying me to marry you, for I shan't. Your hair is the colour of a dandelion, and your cheeks are as pink as a worm." He stood up as he spoke, and so suddenly that the Pink Wax Lady fell over into the hedge. Gummidge turned to the children. "I'm going to talk to that Swede now," he said. The Scarecrows were still tottering about in the field, tumbling over one another and making frantic efforts to keep on their legs. Susan was particularly interested in one lady Scarecrow who wore a cloak of sacking and who carried a little paper windmill in her hand. Her face was as brown as a potato, and she had bright green hair, sprouting rather low down on her forehead. She had bottle straw boots and a blue check apron, and she moved hoppingly like a sparrow. "Good evening, Mr. Gummidge," she said as she hurried up to him. Then she held out the paper windmill. "For you," she said simply. Gummidge beamed at her, took the windmill and waved it joyfully. "I've not seen you for a month of Sundays," he said. "I'm at Dimden now," she answered. "I've a lovely field there." "That's a good step away," said Gummidge. "But I don't have to step," said the little creature. "I've got a bike now." She scuttled away to the hedge and presently returned, dragging a perambulator wheel that was fixed to a long pole. She arranged herself astride it and began to paddle along with her legs. Really, she moved much more slowly than when she was walking, for the wheel sank deeply into the clarty soil, but she seemed to be enjoying herself. Gummidge looked envious. "I wish I'd a bike," he said wistfully. "Ooh, I've often longed for one." Then he remembered the children. "These are my friends," he said. And this, he waved his arm to the cyclist Scarecrow. "This is Miss Earthy Mangold." The children shook hands solemnly. They liked the twiggy feeling of Earthy Mangold's fingers. "I wish I'd a bike," repeated Gummidge. I'll lend you mine, said Earthy. She really was a dear little thing. Then Susan remembered the birthday presents, and she gave Gummidge the stockings, the pink money box, and the card case. Gummidge snatched them hurriedly, and then he flopped down onto the ground. He seemed to be delighted with the money box. Earthy Mangold looked so longingly at the stockings and the card case that he threw them at her. Wedding present, he said. Whose wedding? Asked Earthy. That'd be telling, muttered Gummidge. Before Earthy could ask any more questions, John remembered his presents, and he threw the cake of soap, the toothpaste, and the picture postcard into Gummidge's lap. Much obliged, I'm sure, muttered Wurzel. But he was not looking at the presents. He was staring at Earthy Mangold's little brown face. He stared so long that the children thought he must have fallen into one of his sulks, so they hurried away to join a group of scarecrows who were throwing lumps of mud at a smaller one. As soon as the children came near, the scarecrows all stumped away to another corner of the field. Susan and John wandered away rather disconsolately until they reached the place where the Swede scarecrow stood. The notice board was still planted in front of him, and he looked as foolish as ever. They say that's the enemy, said a little voice, and the children looked round and saw the three-legged scarecrow. The battle is going to begin at cockcrow. That's always the proper time for battles. Shall we be able to fight? Asked John. But before the little creature had time to reply, there was a hoarse shout from Gummidge. Come here! I wants you! They ran back to the other side of the field, where they saw a most remarkable sight. Sitting on Gummidge's knee and lathering his uneven chin with John's new toothpaste was Earthy Mangold. Gummidge took the brush out of his mouth and then said proudly, Me and her are going to get married, aren't we, Earthy? Yes, Wurzel dear, replied Earthy shyly. Gummidge beamed at her. May we come and stay with you when you are married? Asked Susan eagerly. Wurzel Gummidge looked puzzled. We shan't be staying ourselves, he said slowly. We're going to walk about the world for a bit. You can stay here if you like until we come back. That is, if we do come back. I wouldn't like to stay here with that horrid new scarecrow, said Susan. Oh, I'd forgotten all about him, said Gummidge. We've got to have our battle now. Come on, Earthy. But the little creature burst into a storm of green tears. Don't leave me, Wurzel, she sobbed. You might get your face altered before I've got used to it. Do you like my face, Ducky? Asked Gummidge tenderly. It's a lovely face, said Earthy, and each side's different. That's what I like about it. She put up a small hand and patted Gummidge's nose. Now you hold my coat, my dear, said Gummidge. You hold my coat, and then the robins won't get spilt. We'll have a lovely walk this evening. He took off his coat and handed it to Earthy Mangold, who continued to sob bitterly. Gummidge patted her on the head in a most consoling manner, and then, followed by the children, he walked sideways until he stood opposite to the Swede. Susan looked back and saw that Earthy was riding her bicycle up and down by the hedge side. She was a cheerful little thing and appeared to have forgotten all about the battle. The other scarecrows crowded round Gummidge, who rooted up the notice board and slapped the Swede hard in the face. We'll pick sides, shouted Gummidge. I'll choose the first 6 because it's my birthday, and then you can choose 6. The Swede continued to smile stupidly. I don't think he understands, said John. There's none so deaf as those won't hear, retorted Gummidge, and then he roared loudly. I choose Clarty and Singled and Wurzel Furrow and Bulgy and Sprouter and Blight. 6 tall, fierce-looking scarecrows staggered forward and stood in a row. Susan noticed with horror that one of them carried a pitchfork. "It's your turn now," shouted Wurzel Gummidge. The Swede smiled quite pleasantly. "Now I'm warning you," said Gummidge, and he shook a knobbly finger. "I'm warning you, if you don't choose, I shall, and then I shall have the biggest army." Still the Swede smiled. "Muddy!" screamed Gummidge. "Muddy and root-bound and soggy boggart and scare-a-tater and ragbag and mangoldie." 6 more scarecrows joined Gummidge's army. One of these was a lady who wore a basket on her head. "Your turn again," said Gummidge to the Swede. But before the other had time to smile, he shouted, "Ditcher and Bulger and Spring Up and Yarrow." There were only 2 scarecrows left. One of them was the little Upsy-Daisy, and the other was a lady whose hair was made of tarred string. "What's your name?" asked Gummidge. "Hannah," replied the lady in a low voice. "Hannah what?" "Hannah Harrow," she replied meekly, and then added, "I can't fight. The mice have been at me." She sagged as she spoke and flopped emptily to the ground. The children saw that she lay on a small heap of sawdust that had evidently trickled out of her body. "That's a pity," said Gummidge. "Why, that does seem a pity." Then he shouted, "Upsy-Daisy!" The 3-legged scarecrow rolled towards him and smiled happily. "Let's begin the fight," said Gummidge impatiently. "It really isn't fair for all of us to fight one scarecrow," objected John. "That's all you know about it," said Gummidge. A long pause followed, while some of the scarecrows gathered lumps of clay and others planted their legs deeply down into the ground. And still the Swede stood there and smiled. "I'm sure he doesn't understand," said Susan. "I don't think he's really alive." "Of course he's not alive," said Gummidge. "He's only a sham scarecrow, a mock bogle. I wouldn't fight him if he was alive. I'm much too soft-hearted." "But if he's dead, he can't fight," argued John. "But we're alive, and we can," chirruped Upsy-Daisy. "When are you going to begin, Mr. Gummidge?" But Mr. Gummidge held up a warning finger, and the scarecrows tottered forward to listen. Susan could hear nothing but the rustling of their bodies and the slow creakings of their limbs. Then suddenly, from a distant farm, there came a shrill crow as the earliest rooster sounded the alarm of morning. Gummidge slapped the Swede in the face. Upsy-Daisy trundled along and butted him in the middle. Another scarecrow wrenched his arm so violently that it came out of his sleeve and fell to the ground. They all flocked around, pulling, tugging and twisting, looking like so many rooks on a newly sown furrow. Gummidge stepped back and wiped his forehead. "Ain't it a lovely battle?" he asked. Just at that moment, one of the lady scarecrows seized hold of the Swede's head and jerked it off its pole. "How very, very horrid!" cried Susan, as the head came spinning into her lap. But when she picked it up, she saw that it was only a turnip after all. Certainly the root was carved into the shape of a grinning face, but it was all hard and dried up. Gummidge was quite right. The Swede was only a mock scarecrow and had never had a moment's life. Then John flung himself into the fray and knocked the pole over. He picked it up and raced around the field, while all the scarecrows hurtled after him. Soon there was nothing left of the Swede but odd handfuls of straw, a couple of spade handles, and an old coat. Since these were scattered all over the field, it was difficult to believe they had ever belonged to one another. The children were reminded of hens in a farmyard as they watched the scarecrows. One of them would seize a wisp of straw and carry it into a corner, while all the others would pursue him and try to snatch the trophy away. The little three-legged scarecrow had given up all attempt to walk and was simply rolling along the ground. "Who has won?" she asked, as her face appeared uppermost for an instant. "The Bogles have won," said Gummidge, "and the Swedes have lost everything." He looked proudly about him, and then stooped over something limp that was lying on the ground. The tallest scarecrow bent down to look. "That'll be Hannah," he said. "She does look in a bad way. Poor thing." We'll see what happens to Hannah tomorrow.